Hi, I'm Bob Wormsley, and this is part 3 of our creating an ocean tutorial in Cinema 4D using the free plugin HOT4d. So at the end of tutorial 2, we got this render with a fantastic animated base ocean. We got some fake kind of volumetric sunlight effects in there, and we made some really nice animated foam maps to move across that sea, which make it look far more interesting and much more realistic. This third tutorial is the final touch, and we're going to add these ocean spray elements, and we're going to do that by using the inbuilt particle system in Cinema 4D, thinking particles. So that's what we're going to be doing in this tutorial. Let's jump inside of Cinema 4D and get cracking. So here we are back in Cinema 4D, and this is what the point we reached at the end of tutorial 2 when we'd finished making our animated foam maps, and there's the vertex map which we made those out of. So what we have got is we have our low-res sea here that we use to make our foam maps, and above it we've got our higher-res sea which we use to render our base ocean layer. So the last thing we need to do is we want to make some ocean spray that is coming up from the peaks of these waves. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to use thinking particles. And we're going to do two things. I'm going to show you how you use HOT4d to emit the initial thinking particles from the peaks of these waves. And then I'll show you a bit of espresso on how we'll set up the system to make it look like there's spray being blown off these as the waves develop. So what we need to do, if we have a look in our HOT4d settings, I'm going to use my low-res C for this to get faster feedback and faster results. You would get better results and more defined results if you use the high-resolution C, but it will take a lot longer to render. So I'm going to use my my low quality one, and I think it'll be enough for this camera angle and how we've got this set up. So in HOT4d, we've used absolutely everything apart from these last two bits where it says point selection and particles threshold. And this is where we're going to be controlling the initial emission of particles. So there's a few things we need to do. First of all, what we need to do is select our plane, and we need to make a point selection of this plane. So if I go into point mode, and let's just come out of this camera, and I'll just dolly in. So here are all of our points of our polygons. And all we need to do, we don't have to be precise about this, we just need any point selection. So use your selection tool, drag it across, so we've got these points selected, and then we're going to go to select, set selection, and that creates a point selection tag, and then we can click off just to deactivate that selection. So now what we need to do is go back into HOT4d and drag in this random point selection into this box. Okay, that's the first step, and we do that and press play, and nothing happens at all because there's another part that we need to do. So what we're going to bring in now is a MoGraph, and we're going to pick a matrix object, and as default the matrix object comes in as a cube, and it makes 3 by 3 by 3 clones on the vertices of this cube. We don't want that, obviously, so we're going to change it from grid array to an object. And the object, this is the weird bit, this is the counterintuitive bit. The object, we're going to drag in the point selection, the same one that we put in the HOT4d box. And as soon as we do that, look what happens. A bit of magic happens under the HOT4d hood, and now the matrix object is cloning its clones onto the peaks of our fractal, which is fantastic. And now what we can do is tell the matrix object to generate thinking particles. Let's click on that. Once I've generated the thinking particles, they work separately from the matrix object, so I can just disable it from the view and the render. And now we've got thinking particles being generated dynamically on this fractal, which is being made by HOT4d. And now the particle threshold comes into account. If I push it up, it spreads and creates particles from a larger area. And if we bring the particle threshold down, it's only generating them on the peaks of our waves here. And this is what we want. We want quite few particles, to be honest. We just want them coming off the nice peaky bits here. And this is going to give us the effect that we want. Excellent. So that's looking good. So that is as far as we go with HOT4d. We use it in conjunction with the matrix object to spawn these particles on the peaks of the fractal. And now what we need to do is use a bit of espresso to further control more particles to make our spray. So what I need to do, I need a couple of windows open that I'll keep going back to that we haven't got yet. So the first one is I'm going to bring in simulate thinking particles, and I'm going to need my thinking particles settings. So I'll just click on that and it brings open a window, and I'm going to be referring to this quite a bit and dragging stuff out of it. So I'm going to dock it, and I'm going to dock it here on the side. There it is, and I'll just minimize it a bit because obviously we don't need it that big. And let's bring this over a bit so we can see a bit more. There we go. So here are my thinking particles settings, which I'll be using a bit later. Now we need to open up Espresso and be able to use the Espresso editor. So to do that, I'm going to create a null object, and I'm going to call it TP for thinking particles. And on that null object, I'm going to go to tags, Cinema4d tags. That's just out of your viewport there. But let me just move that so you can see exactly what I'm doing. Tags, Cinema4d tags, and I want Espresso right at the bottom of this menu. So I'll open that up, and here's our Espresso editor. So again, I'm going to dock this on top of all of these ones. So now I can flick between my view and my Espresso editor pretty quickly. And then I'll move this back across. Now I don't need to see that menu. All right, so this is my Espresso area where I'm going to be editing my thinking particles. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use particle groups, and this will make sense in a bit. So I'm going to hit on my particle groups in my settings. I'm going to right click over the all, and I'm going to put add, which will make a new particle group. There it is. And I'm going to double click on that, and I'm going to call that emitter. There we go. And I'm going to change the color to something garish so I can see it, like bright pink. There we go, emitter. And now what I want to do, I want the particles which are being created by the matrix object, I want them to just be these emitter group particles. So the way I do that is I'll just highlight the matrix object, and in this area under generate thinking particles, we have a TP group, thinking particles group, and I want it to be my emitter particles. There we go. So now if I jump back to the viewport and press play, it's only the pink particles which appear in this group which are coming from the matrix object. Okay, so that's great. So now I need another particle group which is going to be the spray, which is what we're going to render. So I'm going to go back onto all, right click, add another group. This one I'm going to call spray. And I'm going to change the color of that to like a blue cyany type color. And if I press play, we're not going to see any blue particles because we haven't created any blue ones yet. But we're going to be using that in a little bit once we have. So what we want to do is this. We want to tell thinking particles, wherever there is a pink emitter particle, I want to emit lots more spray particles from this position. So for every pink particle, I want it to spit out 15 or so blue particles, which will be our spray. That's what we'll render. So how do we do that? Well, what we need to do is go to Espresso, and we need to say, take the pink ones, find out where their position is, and emit new ones from that position. So the way we do it is we go right click, new node, thinking particles, thinking particle initiator, p pass, particle pass. Okay. And in this, by default, it's saying all particles, but we don't want that. All I want is the emitter particles. So I want to take the emitter particles and I want to find their position. So I need to get that data from this node. So we go to new node, thinking particles, helper, and we want a particle get data node. Click that. Okay. So we want to get the particles from this emitter. That's it. And we want to spit out of there their position. So we click position. So now we have got their position as an output. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to stick that position into a new particle emitter. So we're going to go to right click, new node, thinking particles, generator, which are what generate new particles, and we're going to use p-storm for this. That's it. And if I click on the p-storm, you can see its attributes here, all the controls for this storm. So as a default, it's going to spit out 100 particles, and the particles are going to live for 75 frames before dying, and they've got a speed of 100. So let's just have a look at what that looks like in the viewport. I'll just hide the C. So here is this emitter that we've just made, this circle. If I press play, here are the particles coming out of it. 100 particles, 75 frames they last for, and they're going at a speed of 100 across. So we don't need the diameter of this emitter to be this big. It'd be ridiculous if we had one of these huge emitters for every particle here. So I'm going to reduce it down to 0. So now this emitter is just spitting out like that. And they're spitting out in this cone shape because, let's just bring that camera out, see the cone shape, and they're spitting out of that because of this angle here. It's set at 45 degrees, and that might just work for us actually. Okay, so that's the default standard emitter. So how do we attach it to all these particles? So let's go back to our Espresso editor. So what we want to say is the emitter position, we want to take that from the position of our purple particles. So we'll just connect that to emitter position. Now I'm not going to press play now, because if I press play, all of these pink particles, and there's about 3,000 of them, are all going to spit out 100 particles. So that is a lot, and the computer will grind to a halt. So let's just put that down to 1. And I'm going to change the birth type from count to shot. So now what we're saying is for every pink particle, there should be a newly generated white particle. So let's just have a look. Go back. There we go. So it's shooting out 1 particle every frame from these pink particles. And it's looking a bit of a mess at the moment, admittedly. But it's working. So we want these new particles to be part of this blue spray particle group. At the moment, they're coming out and they're white. So it's not working. So what we need to do is go back to our Espresso editor. And we need to say that when these particles are born, they need to join this group. So I'm going to right click, new node, thinking particles, standard, particle group. So I'll join that up to the particle group, and I'll drag our spray group into there. So now if this is working right, we should be getting blue particles. There we go. Cool. So at this point, we don't need to see our emitter particles anymore, the purple ones. We're not rendering these. We're just using their position to spit out our new spray ones. So if I click on the emitter one here and view type, I'm going to switch that to none. And it'll just mean it'll redraw a bit more quickly in the viewport. But we can still see our blue ones. Okay, great. So at the moment, obviously, they're moving far too quickly across the plane. and they're moving in the Z direction. And this obviously doesn't look right. So what we need to do is slow them down a little bit. So I'm going to go to the Espresso editor, click on the generator, and I'm going to change this speed value from 100 to say, oh, let's try just a little bit of speed. Let's try 20. And I always want a bit of variation here. If you have speed variation, it's going to stop you getting a stepping effect, because the particles are being emitted every frame, and sometimes you can see very rigid, regular step patterns in your particles, and that obviously just doesn't look realistic. So if we put some speed variation in there, let's just say I'm going to put 100% speed variation, it should hopefully smooth all that out. So let's have a look at what we've got now. We've reduced that speed hugely. All right. So I think that is starting to look a little bit more like what we want. Tell you what, just for now, I'm going to go to HOT4d and I'm going to reduce the amount of particles that are being emitted so we can see a little bit more detail, and then we'll increase that when it comes to render time. Okay, that's better. So now it's moving a bit more quickly and we can see what's happening. So what we have got are these particles being released from the tops of the waves. There we go. And so it's working quite nicely. So obviously they're hanging around and living for far too long. We want the spray to be dissipating quite quickly. So let's go back to our Espresso editor, back to the generator. They're lasting for 75 frames, which is way too long. I mean, we want less than a second. So I'm going to try 15 frames life with, let's say, 15% variation. So now I think we'll start getting something that looks a bit more like what we're after. There we go. So now we've got this spray being emitted, which is falling slightly behind the waves, which is great. Okay, so that's looking quite nice. All right, so the last thing I want to do, you can see I want to mimic them being, the spray being kind of emitted with the wave, but then being kicked up by heavy wind, because we've got a really choppy sea here with lots of foam. So I want the wind to be pushing this spray up. So what we need to do is use a dynamic effect in thinking particles to push them up, and it's called a wind. We're going to use a wind. So what we need to do is bring in a object to attach that wind to. So the way we're going to do this, I'm going to make a null. So let's make another null object, and I'm going to call this wind. All right, in a minute, obviously, it's going to do nothing. It's just a null object that's called wind. Let me just hide my C for now. So let's go back into Espresso. And what I want to say is, for every spray particle, I want you to be affected by some wind. So I need to take a P pass again. So if I control and drag any of these, it makes a duplicate. So this is my new P pass. And this time I want to say, right, take all of the spray particles, the blue ones, and I want to feed them into a wind effector. So I'm going to right click, new node, thinking particles, dynamic, wind. All right. And the spray I want to be affected by the wind. Now at the moment the wind won't do anything because you have to attach it to an object, and that's why we made our wind null. So if I drag this wind null into the wind, and if I press, go back to the viewport, so now what we've got is this diagram which is attached to our null object. And it's got an arrow, and that's telling you which direction the wind is blowing. So let's just press play. So at the moment the wind is blowing quite strongly the same direction as the water flow. So the particles are just going to get blown off really quickly. Let's have a look. So the wind is really pushing them and blowing them in this direction, which isn't what we want. What we actually want. In fact, I'm just going to go back to Espresso and I'm just going to boost my wind up so it's really strong, just so we can see the effects of it. And that spray hasn't gone into that P pass properly. There we go. Okay, so that actually wasn't being affected. Let's have a look now. And so these are really going to get blown off as soon as they've been spawned. So the wind is pushing them away, pushing them away. And I don't want mine to go forwards. You might, but I want mine to be emitted and then pushed backwards. That's how I want my spray to look. So what I'm able to do, now this wind is attached to a null object, I can go to the rotation tool and I can rotate the null, which will rotate the wind. And you can see, look, it's affecting the particles. And I want it to blow back on itself like this. Excellent. So that's what I want. Obviously, I don't want the wind to be that strong, but that's the movement that I want. There we go. So as they are being emitted, they're being blown back by this wind. But at the moment, obviously, they're being affected too much. So let's go back to the Espresso editor, back to wind, and I'm going to reduce it. I mean, it's way strong. 500's a ridiculous value. I'm going to try putting in maybe just 20. With a 5% decay. Let's have a look at what that looks like in our viewport. Okay, so that is looking better. So we've got them being emitted from the tops of the peaks of the waves, and they're being blown upwards a little bit. Just pause it a bit. So I think we could maybe have that wind slightly stronger. So they're being pushed up a little bit more. So let's go back to the wind and let's try 40. Yeah, it's giving it a bit of lift now, which I like. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to change my spray from ticks to dots so I can see a little bit more detail. That's better. That's better. Right, we can see a bit better now. So that wind is pushing them up, and it looks like it's been blown off the top of the waves. Yep, I like that. That's looking really good. Okay, so I think we're ready with our particle simulation. That's going to do me for now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slightly increase in HOT4d the particle threshold because I want slightly more produced. Let's just try that. Yeah, a bit more coverage now. Yeah, that's going to do me. And now we're getting near render time. I want to produce more particles. At the moment, I've just got one blue particle for every pink one. And I want it to be way more. So I'm going to go back to my Espresso editor, back to PStorm, and I'm going to change the shot value from 1 and whack it up to 15. And what I'm looking for is about just under 1 million particles, kind of halfway through the simulation. So let's see what the difference that makes making that 15. It'll run a lot more slowly because we've got way more particles being created. And here in your particle settings is the amount. So look, 600,000 at the moment. Still going up. 700,000. And it'll start to kind of calm down and stop going up as the older particles die off. But we're increasing more now. We've got 750,000 approximately. So I think that's going to work for us. All right. So we've got all this nice particle spray. Now we have a little bit of a problem with some stepping here. You see this stepping as they're particles are being released off the vertices of the plane, and it looks a little bit too regular. But I think with the way in which we're going to render this, I think we're going to be okay with that. And I'll show you how we can get around smoothing some of those stepping bits out. And especially now we're back in the scene camera, I think this is looking okay. All right, so that is how we create the particles. So now, obviously, if I press render, the particles don't render. So we need our rendering strategy. What are we going to do? Well, we're going to render these particles with PyroCluster, which is a very old volume tracing renderer in Cinema 4D. It's a bit derided. Most people say it's rubbish and kind of take the mick, but it's actually, for certain things, it's okay, if a little slow. And for us, it's going to work fine. And the beauty is that it ships with Cinema 4D, so it's not an additional paid-for plugin, which is keeping this tutorial completely free. Right, so what do we need to do to render with PyroCluster? Well, we need a couple of things. First of all, I'm going to go down to my Create menu here, and we need two things. We've got a shader, and we need a PyroCluster volume tracer object. So let's click that, and it appears as a material. And we need another one, so shader, and we need a PyroCluster material. So here are our two PyroCluster elements that we need to render. You can see this one looks like a little cloud. The next thing we need to do is we need to create an environment for this to be able to read the volume. So to do that, we're going to go to the floor menu here, and we're going to select environment, and we're going to drag the PyroCluster volume tracer onto the environment. And this is setting up this area to be able to volume render these particles. So now what we're going to do is we need something to be able to attach the PyroCluster texture to. And we can't put it on the matrix, that's not going to work. So what we need is one more object, and it is a particle geometry. So we're going to go to Simulate, Thinking Particles, Particle Geometry. Let's just bring that down. And this is what we want to render. So in the particle geometry settings, we want to drag in the spray group. We only want to render the spray, the blue particles. Great. And now we can put our PyroCluster material onto the particle geometry. Now don't hit render on standard default PyroCluster settings. Do not hit render. Because if you do, there's a very, very good chance that Cinema will hang and crash, or your computer might melt. Because as it's set up, the default settings on PyroCluster are not set up for using almost 1 million particles. So we're going to make some adjustments. So what we're going to be doing with PyroCluster is adjusting 3 main values which have a huge impact on quality of render and render time. And those 3 values are this. There is one value in the PyroCluster volume tracer. I'll just double click that to bring up the settings, and I'll just move that down. So what we're going to do is, this is the world step size, and this is the value that we're going to mess around with. But to activate that, we need to change from this preset of crispy to user, and we're going to be adjusting this world step size. So that's one of the values that we're going to adjust, and I know for a start that I need it lower than that. 3. So the world step size is kind of the quality of the render. It's how small and how many steps it takes to make its calculations. So the smaller the step size, the longer it will take to calculate and render, but the better quality it will be. The higher the world step size, the quicker it will take to calculate, but the quality won't be as good. So we're going to be pushing and pulling on this to try and decrease render times, but without making it look too shonky. So that's the first setting we're going to be looking at. We're also going to be looking at a couple of settings in the PyroCluster material. So the first setting we're going to be looking at here is density. This is how transparent or opaque the smoke is. So the lower the density, the more transparent it is and the longer it takes to render. The higher the density, the more opaque it is and the quicker it is to render. And then the only other setting that we're going to be playing with to try and reduce render times but get good quality is in the shape menu, and it is the radius of this cloud. Now, if you think at the moment, the radius at the moment of each individual particle cloud is set to 100 centimeters. So each one of these particles is going to be making a cloud about that big, which obviously is way too much. And all of those clouds are going to be overlapping with each other, which means it's having to make a ridiculous amount of calculations to work out how the light is passing through all of that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put this right down to say, let's try 4 centimeters for a radius, and let's give that a render now and see what happens. So it's preparing the particles, chugging away, and here we go. So it's starting to render those particles, and you can see each of these clouds is now kind of overlapping. It looks pretty awful at the moment. Now what I'd say is that the first problem is that the cloud is way too dense. There's not enough light getting through this. There's too much light reflecting off it, which is giving this really bright, thick, milky look, and this is way too much. So the first thing I'm going to do to try and rectify that is I'm going to go to my globals, and I'm going to bring my density down from the default 10 to, let's just bring it down by a factor of 10. So we'll put it on 1, and you can see even in the preview it's gone much more transparent looking. So let's give this one a render now and see what happens. So unfortunately with PyroCluster there's just going to be a bit of pushing and pulling with these 3 different values until we've got a look that we're happy with but isn't taking an absolute huge amount of time to render. Alright, so again it's still way too bright. So let's just try, we're going to bring the density down further, but let's just see what happens if we reduce the radius of the shape a little bit more, because there's a lot of overlap at the moment. So let's just try, if we put this on 3 centimeters, let's see what the effect is. So that last render took 26 seconds. Let's see what difference making it 3 centimeters makes. And the theory goes, because there's less overlapping smoke, it should be quicker. It looks quicker already, doesn't it? Maybe not fractionally quicker, but we're only talking about seconds. So it's looking more detailed, but we're starting to see individual clouds now and this speckliness. And I think we're not going to get away with that in the render. So I'm going to put that radius back up to 4 as it was. And I'm going to reduce in the globals the density even further. So let's just do it by another factor of 10. So we'll make the density now 0.1. Let's give it a render. Now this could take longer to render now that it's having to calculate a more transparent material because it's less dense. And I think it is, but it's not too much of a hit. This might be maybe 25 seconds once it's completely rendered. So now on the edges we're starting to get this spray effect. So we're getting there, but there's still a little bit too much white opaque cloud here. So I'm going to go even more. So let's reduce that density by a factor of 10 again to 0.01. And we'll render that. And we're gradually getting there, I think. So I'd be happy with if we could have it being 30 seconds per frame to render. I could live with that, I think. It would take a couple hours of chugging away, but I think it would be okay. Alright, so now we can see we're starting to get the detail of this spray. Now we're reducing this density. There's a little bit of speckliness and a little bit of kind of gridding here. But I think once this is screened over our ocean with all of those foam maps and the reflections, I don't think we're going to notice this. I think we'll get away with having it this quality. I'm just going to try reducing this density one more time to get a little bit of this reduced, this white streaking. So I'm going to go to 0.005. Let's try that one. And I think this is the setting that we'll go with. And we'll set it up to render. So here we go. Yeah, look, we're starting to look a little bit more translucent and spray-like. Yeah, and we're getting these streaks, but it's looking transparent now. It's not looking as opaque. I think this is going to work for us. And as it looks here, you think, well, it doesn't really look that great. It looks a bit shonky. But you'd be amazed once this is screened over our ocean comp in After Effects. It's going to look great. And I think for this camera angle, at this point, at this resolution, I think this is going to do us. So great, let's go for a render. And it's a 20 second per frame on my machine, which is not the end of the world. Okay, so let's get this rendering then. So I'm going to go to my render settings. And in the output, I'm going to render all frames. In the save menu, I don't need an alpha channel because this is a black and white image and we're going to screen it on top. So I'm going to save it into my tutorials, Ocean Tuts, Ocean Tut 3. I'll make a new folder, call it spray, and I'm going to save it into there, and I'll call it Ocean 3 spray. Okay, that looks good. I've got my scene camera selected. Everything is sorted. Oh, there's one thing I must do before I hit render. Thank God I remembered that. What we need to do is we want this low poly plane to be visible in the render, but we want it to be completely black. We want to use it as a matte object to mask out any of the particles that should be hidden by any of the waves or anything. So the way we're going to do that is really simple. We're going to select the object. I'm just going to pull it over so you can see this menu. So have the plane selected, and we're going to go to tags, Cinema 4D tags, compositing tag, and in the compositing tag we're going to hit matte object and make sure that the color's black. Okay, and that is going to mask out some of the particles if they ever should be hidden behind these waves. It'll make it look much more realistic. Right, so now we've done that, we're ready to render. So I'm just going to hit render to picture viewer. This will start chugging away, and there it goes. There's our spray. So we'll leave that going, and I'll pause the tutorial here, and I'll come back, jump in After Effects, tell you how long it took, and we'll start comping this together. So here we are back in After Effects, and this is where we left off our compositing from tutorial 2. That render of that spray, by the way, took about 2 hours and 20 minutes on my system. So this is our composition, and we have our, let's go through what assets we've got. So we've got the background, which is our gradient. We've got our base ocean, which is the base render. We have got our foam 1 render. We have got our foam 2 render, which is the one that hangs around on the surface for longer. We have got our glints, which were the which were the reflection hits from the base ocean render, and we've got our glints that had the fake kind of like streaks on, that was faking a bit of volumetric sunlight, and we had our sun object as well, which again was faking a bit of that nice glowy sunlight. So that's how it all looked. And that's the render. So what we need to do now is bring in our spray. So we'll just double click here, and I'm looking for my spray render, ocean spray. There it is. So bring it in, and what I'm going to do with this spray is I'm going to bring it in underneath the glints and the streaks, And there it goes. And I'll just solo it. So here is our spray render that came out of Cinema 4D. Black and white image. Some of the particles have been masked out by the matte object that we set on the plane. And it's looking all right. So now all we need to do is set this to screen mode. And let's have a look. How's it looking? Not too bad. I think we could perhaps increase the exposure ever so slightly to just brighten up and make it a wee bit more prominent. So we'll select that layer and we'll go to Effect, Color Correction, Exposure, and let's just boost this exposure up just a bit. If we bring it up way too much, obviously it's going to be too prominent, but we want a little bit more, I think. There we go. That's looking better. So that's much more prominent in the mix. Very nice. Maybe even a fraction more. And that is the addition of our spray. So again, I won't bother previewing this because it'll take forever to load it into the RAM. I'll render this out and then we'll show you the final effect with the ocean and the glints and the foam, and then this final effect of that ocean spray. And there we go, there's our finished render. So we've got our base ocean, we've got those glints, 2 glint passes on there, we've got some nice sunlight streaks, we've got our 2 foam maps that are doing their stuff, and now we've got that final element on there, which is our ocean spray, which really lifts the piece. And I think it's a pretty good look, especially if you bear in mind there are no paid for plugins using this. So that's it. That's the basics of setting up a nice ocean scene using the free plugin HOT4d. So if you could subscribe to me if you haven't already, that'd be fantastic. If you could like the video, that would help me out a lot too. And also you can comment. And in the comments, if you've got any recommendations or any requests for tutorials, please feel free to add those. And there'll be loads more Cinema 4D tutorials coming your way very soon. So until next time, cheers.